And yesterday, to conclude it, I participated in an interesting, because again it brings these dynamics together, an interesting conference in Holland. A conference which had in its themes, themes on peace, security, Israel, international law, and the like. And while those themes were being discussed within the framework of the meeting, outside the meeting was an apartheid tent with all the graffiti of lawfare. Whatever you wanted, there it was, in terms of placards, in terms of pamphlets, in terms of graffiti, in terms of marches, in terms of demonstrations. And in fact, the Carnegie Foundation, interestingly enough, which was one of the co-sponsors of the conference, said, and the conference was held, symbolically enough, in the Peace Palace at The Hague, where it was opened up with the notion that The Hague is the symbol for the city of justice and the city of peace, and that we were gathered in The Hague, which had become the home, as I acknowledge and put it in my own remarks to the conference. This was the embodiment of the revolution, if you will, of international human rights and humanitarian law, the home now of the ICC, of the International Criminal Tribunals for former Rwanda and for former Yugoslavian Rwanda, and yet again, as I say, the convergence of lawfare and the human rights revolution converging as they did in The Hague and going in very different directions. And so let me summarize, and the organizer of the conference, I want them at the Carnegie Foundation, said they had never, in all their conferences that they have been participants in, and so did the people at the Peace Palace, ever get as many complaints and demands not to hold the conference, because the conference was going to have as one of its thematic references a reference to the question of the peace of Israel under international law and the like. Now let me close by summarizing some basic propositions that I think can help frame our thinking with regard to lawfare. One, lawfare is not a new phenomenon, as I mentioned in terms of Zionism, racism, revolution, and other matters that we're developing incrementally under the radar screen. What is different is that we now have a critical mass of lawfare in a way that we never had it before. Two, this is being aided and abetted by a series of dynamics which are not in and of themselves prejudicial, but which get mobilized in the lawfare dynamic. These are globalization of rights, of law, of communication, of NGOs, in effect, the globalization of the human rights revolution. The revolution in international human rights and humanitarian law. The manner in which the Arab-Israeli conflict has been reframed as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and where a new paradigm emerges where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen as being the source of all conflict in the Middle East and beyond. The occupation is being seen as the source of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the apartheid state Israel is seen as the source of the occupation, if not as a kind of a globalizing evil. And so you've had an ongoing narrative shift. The best example in historical and dramatic terms is, and that which I think many in this room will recall, that in the 70s and 80s, the organizing narrative in international human rights and juridical terms at the time was the Helsinki Final Act, the struggle for Soviet Jewry, the prisoners of conscience like Sharansky and the like. The narrative today is a very different narrative. It is the Palestinization of human rights, which is being used and abused with respect to the exercise of lawfare. Point number three, while lawfare does not only involve Israel, there have been, for example, with regard to universal jurisdictions, initiatives taken against American nationals and the like in Belgium and elsewhere. The launching of delegitimization under the cover of law, legal institutions, the courts and the like, primarily targets Israel. If you look at universal jurisdiction, there is no other country which at one and the same time, as we speak, there are arrest warrants out, whether it be in the United Kingdom, or whether it be in Spain, or whether it be in New Zealand. I can go on. In other words, the universality of this lawfare. And so if I can borrow from an aphorism where we used to say that while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews in the matters of anti-Semitism, I think in lawfare you might say while it may begin with Israel, It does not and will not end with Israel in that regard. Next point, that we need to appreciate, and I'm going to try to just frame this a bit, what are the constituents of lawfare? Time does not permit, so one-liners, if you'll permit me, as some very gross generalizations by way of a snapshot. One, the laundering of delegitimization under the protective cover of the United Nations. One can go on at length and speak only of this, but you know you have, among other things, the annual ritual of the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. But if you read those resolutions, they read, as it were, like legal judgments, findings of fact, conclusions of law, so they're framed in juridical terms. And while people maybe want to dismiss this as a person who's partaken of delegations, be it to the UN General Assembly or the UN Human Rights Council, I can tell you that there's a critical mass of respondents there. There are diplomats, there are parliamentarians, there are lawyers, there are students, there are NGOs, there are media, and like all of whom listen to, partake of, and willy-nilly imbibe that kind of delegitimization under the protective cover of the UN. The second